On August the 12th, 2026, inside the headquarters of the United States Trade Representative in Washington, a meeting that was scheduled to run for 30 minutes stretched into an hour and a half. Two Canadian officials sat across the table from the man Donald Trump has entrusted to reshape America's trade relationship with its northern neighbor. 7 days later, on August the 19th, 50% tariffs are set to hit roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods. Milk, beer, hockey sticks, plywood, cement. That is not a threat anymore. That is a date on a calendar. And the question hanging over Washington right now is whether the man running point on this negotiation has miscalculated just how far Canada is willing to bend before it simply stops bending at all. This is the story of how a trade dispute between two of the closest allies on Earth turned into one of the tensest standoffs in North American economic history, and how Canada's Prime Minister, a former central banker with a reputation for careful, measured language, has started answering Washington's pressure with blunt public defiance. To understand where this stands today, you have to go back to where it started. Long before this particular deadline, long before this particular trade representative took his seat, the United States and Canada were already locked in a tariff dispute that had been escalating for more than a year. According to the Globe and Mail, the Trump administration layered Section 232 national security tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum, hitting both countries at 50% and a 25% tariff on automobiles not built in the United States. Canada, whose economy is deeply intertwined with American manufacturing, especially in the auto sector, where parts can cross the border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished, responded the way governments usually do when tariffs land on their exporters. It retaliated. Ottawa imposed its own tariffs on American-made vehicles, and several Canadian provinces went further, pulling American alcohol off store shelves entirely. That single decision, pulling bottles of American wine and spirits off shelves in Ontario and British Columbia and Quebec, became one of the most cited grievances on the American side of this negotiation. It is a small, almost symbolic act, but according to reporting from the Globe and Mail, it is one of the specific irritants that U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has repeatedly flagged as something Canada needs to walk back before broader tariff relief is even on the table. Jameson Greer is the man at the center of this story. He is not a household name outside of trade circles, but inside Washington, he is the person Donald Trump has put in charge of negotiating with both Canada and Mexico as the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement. The trade pact that replaced NAFTA heads toward a mandatory review. According to Reuters, on July the 1st, 2026, the Trump administration made a consequential decision. Rather than renewing that agreement in its current form for another extended term, the United States entered a 10-year cycle of annual reviews and renegotiation instead. Officials, according to Reuters, said the existing pact had failed to shrink trade deficits the way the president wanted, and left what Washington considers unresolved problems in dairy, in autos, and in a handful of other industrial sectors. That decision reshaped the entire negotiating landscape. Instead of one clean renewal process, Canada and the United States are now negotiating on multiple tracks at once, a near-term deal to avoid the August 19th tariffs, and a longer, more complicated renegotiation of the underlying trade agreement that Greer himself has said will stretch into 2027. And this is where the cornering strategy that the title of this video refers to actually starts to take a recognizable shape in the public record. According to the Globe and Mail, Greer's stated preference has been to secure what he calls interim arrangements with Canada and Mexico separately, deals focused narrowly on what Washington considers the most urgent bilateral irritants, before moving on to the far more complex structural issues, like content rules for the deeply integrated auto industry that both countries actually care about resolving. Speaking to the Senate Finance Committee in July, Greer put it plainly, "I would love to have, between now and the end of the year, at least some arrangements, one with Canada, one with Mexico," he told senators, according to Reuters and multiple outlets including the Western Producer and DTN. On its face, that sounds reasonable. Get something done quickly, work out the harder details later. But Canadian negotiators and independent analysts watching from Ottawa have read it differently. The Globe and Mail's reporting lays out the core tension bluntly. Washington's preferred negotiating sequence clashes with Ottawa's top imperative in the talks, which is to get Trump's punitive tariffs on autos, steel, and aluminum lifted or meaningfully reduced. Greer's preference, according to that same reporting, would effectively see Canada give up negotiating leverage, dropping its retaliatory tariffs, opening its dairy market further, walking back the alcohol restrictions, without any guaranteed tariff relief in return. In plain terms, Washington's ask has been, make your concessions first and trust that relief follows. Canada's answer, for months now, has been some version of not without something binding in writing. That is the corner Trump's trade chief has been trying to build, and it has not gone unnoticed. Among the American demands, according to the Globe and Mail, are that Canada grant greater access to its protected dairy market and stop retaliating against Trump's tariffs altogether. In a CNBC interview reported by conservative outlets tracking the negotiations closely, Greer laid out his case on dairy specifically, arguing that Canada applies looser quota rules toward the European Union than it does toward the United States, funneling access instead through dairy cooperatives that Washington views as gatekeepers protecting Canadian producers from American competition. Whether you find that argument persuasive or not, it is a real, on-the-record claim from the man running the American side of this negotiation, and it has become one of the sharpest points of disagreement between the two capitals. Now, layer onto that the tariffs themselves, the ones actually scheduled to take effect. According to the Epoch Times and multiple outlets, including the Western Producer, the Trump administration announced 50% tariffs on approximately $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, hitting products like beer, dairy, and, in a detail that has become something of a symbol in Canadian media coverage, hockey sticks. These tariffs were imposed under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision so rarely invoked in modern trade policy that the Globe and Mail specifically noted it had never been used before in this way. The stated purpose, according to that reporting, is explicit: to pressure Canada into giving ground on provincial alcohol bans, on dairy quota allocation, and on Ottawa's retaliatory auto tariffs. Those tariffs do not take effect immediately. They were built with a runway, giving both governments a window to negotiate before the deadline arrives. That window closes on August the 19th. By early August, according to Bloomberg, the numbers being discussed for the goods affected had grown, with some reporting placing the value at closer to $28 billion, once additional categories like cement and additional lumber products were factored in. So that is the pressure Washington has applied. Now here is how Ottawa has responded. And this is where Prime Minister Mark Carney's public posture becomes the second half of this story. Mark Carney is not a career politician in the traditional sense. Before he became Prime Minister, he ran two different central banks, the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England, building a reputation as a careful technical communicator, not someone prone to political theater. That is part of what makes his public language over the past several months so notable. According to CBC News, back in March of 2025, campaigning ahead of a federal election that he would go on to win, Carney told Canadians that nothing is off the table in response to Trump's tariffs. He said his government's response will be to fight, while, in classic Carney fashion, declining to specify exactly what that meant. Reuters reported the same phrase from that period. "Nothing is off the table to defend our workers and our country," Carney said, adding that the old economic and security relationship between Canada and the United States was, in his words, over. That framing, old relationship over, new posture required, has essentially defined Carney's approach to Washington ever since, and it escalated sharply this year. In January, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Carney used a high-profile speech to condemn what he called economic coercion by larger powers against smaller countries. He did not name the United States directly in that framing, but nobody in the room, and nobody covering it, mistook his meaning. According to reporting from Barchart and the Associated Press, that speech triggered a direct rebuke from U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who warned Carney that picking a public fight with Washington could backfire heading into the formal review of the trade agreement that protects Canada from the heaviest of Trump's tariffs. "I would not pick a fight going into USMCA to score some cheap political points," Bessent said in a CNBC interview, adding a pointed jab at Carney's background. "I've seen what happens when a technocrat tries to pivot and become a politician. It never really works out well." Carney did not walk that back. When reporters asked him about it, days later he doubled down. "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos," Carney told reporters, according to that same reporting. Bessent, for his part, told Fox News after a phone call between Trump and Carney that the Prime Minister had been very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made at Davos. Carney's own account, delivered the very next day, directly contradicted that characterization. That same week in January, tensions spiked again over an entirely separate issue: China. According to Fox News, Trump threatened on social media to impose 100% tariffs on Canada if Ottawa struck a trade deal that would make Canada what he called a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the United States. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken, Trump wrote on Truth Social, according to Fox News reporting. China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it. The Council on Foreign Relations noted that this outburst followed Canada's announcement earlier that same month of plans to reduce tariffs on some Chinese electric vehicle imports, and came just after Carney had met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing. Carney's response, delivered days later and reported by the Associated Press, was direct. Canada, he said, has no intention of pursuing a free trade agreement with China. By the summer, the temperature had risen again, and this time it turned personal. In early August, according to the Washington Post and PBS NewsHour, Trump used a speech in Las Vegas to go after Canada's leadership directly. Canada's nasty. They are. They're nasty, Trump told the crowd. I love the people, but they're nasty. Nasty leadership. Carney, speaking to reporters in Toronto the next day, addressed it head-on, and notably chose to respond in French. This is a tough negotiation, Carney said, according to the Washington Times and The Hill. You can say nasty, but this is a question of Canadian jobs. It's a question of the future of Canadian businesses. PBS reported that Carney actually laughed when asked directly about Trump's description of the talks, telling reporters, "We're in the middle of a tariff war with the Americans." He noted that Canadian negotiators were in Washington that very week, and that he expected further direct conversations with Trump after having spoken with him the previous week. Carney also pointed to a concrete economic consequence of the standoff, telling reporters that existing U.S. tariffs on aluminum had contributed to a 58% increase in aluminum prices inside the United States itself, a detail confirmed in the Washington Times' reporting, and one Carney has used to argue that the tariffs are hurting American consumers and manufacturers as much as Canadian exporters. That is the emotional and political backdrop against which the current, more concrete negotiating drama has played out, and it has intensified sharply in just the last 2 weeks. According to the Globe and Mail, on the Thursday before the August 19th deadline, Canada's Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc and the country's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, sat down with Jameson Greer in Washington for what was supposed to be a routine 30-minute check-in. It ran for 90 minutes instead. Asked on his way into that meeting whether a deal was possible before the deadline, LeBlanc gave a two-word answer that captured the uncertainty hanging over the entire process. I hope so. Afterward, in a social media post accompanied by a photo of the two men smiling together, LeBlanc described the discussion as constructive and detailed, adding that Canada's focus has been and will continue to be on striking a comprehensive deal that addresses sectoral tariffs. That meeting was not an isolated event. According to Reuters, as reported by Indexbox and CTV News, it was the third meeting between LeBlanc, Charette, and Greer in as many weeks, with both sides now racing to put together a framework they can present to President Trump before the deadline arrives. CTV News reported that LeBlanc was seen at USTR headquarters again on a Tuesday in mid-August, alongside Charette, for what both governments are now treating as crunch time diplomacy. LeBlanc wrote afterward that Canada remains committed at the negotiating table and continues to staunchly defend Canadian interests. So what does an actual framework look like at this stage? According to reporting compiled by Transport Topics and corroborated by Bloomberg's August 13th coverage, the shape of a potential deal under discussion would see the United States back away from the 50% Section 338 tariffs and reduce some of the existing Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos. In exchange, Canada would remove certain retaliatory measures of its own and make other concessions, including, notably, walking back some of the provincial restrictions on American alcohol sales that started this entire chapter of the dispute. On paper, that sounds like the makings of a deal both sides could plausibly sign. In practice, according to those same reports, disputes over the specifics of the auto, steel, and aluminum provisions remain unresolved, and there is no finished agreement as of this recording. That framework tracks with separate reporting cited by CBC News, which describes Canada as prepared to halt the provincial alcohol bans and meet several other specific U.S. demands in exchange for tariff relief, according to unnamed sources familiar with the talks. It's a detail that lines up with everything else in this story. The alcohol restrictions, small as they may sound compared to $20 billion tariff packages, keep surfacing again and again as one of the most concrete negotiable items on the table. A piece of the dispute Ottawa appears willing to trade away if it can secure something durable on the tariffs that actually threaten jobs. It helps to understand why the auto sector in particular carries so much weight in these talks. According to PBS NewsHour, the United States already has tariffs in place on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automobiles, and Trump has separately insisted that the U.S. should not be importing finished vehicles from Canada or Mexico at all. But, as PBS also reported, the three countries' auto production is so heavily integrated, with individual parts and partially assembled vehicles crossing the Canada-U.S. border multiple times during a single manufacturing process, that industry groups on both sides of the border have warned Washington is arguably hurting its own manufacturers by taxing its closest trading partners' production. Tariffs, PBS noted, are ultimately taxes on imports that companies frequently pass along to consumers in the form of higher prices and the Trump administration's own justification that the added cost will push manufacturing back into the United States has, according to that same reporting, not yet been strongly reflected in the economic data. There's also a wrinkle that complicates the negotiations further, and it has nothing to do with Washington at all. It is entirely a Canadian domestic political problem. Canada is a federation, and its provinces have real authority over things like alcohol sales and, functionally, significant influence over how national trade positions get shaped politically. According to Transport Topics, in Quebec specifically, Premier Christine Frechette has been pushing to secure reduced tariffs on aluminum, a critical Quebec industry, without giving up major ground on dairy, a sector with its own entrenched provincial politics. A spokesperson for Frechette told reporters that, in the context of what she called the ongoing trade war, the Premier continues to defend Quebec's economic interests. That single sentence captures the deeper challenge Carney is wrestling with. Even if he reaches an agreement with Washington that he considers reasonable, he still has to sell it, or at minimum not provoke open revolt, across a patchwork of provinces with sometimes conflicting economic priorities. As Transport Topics put it, that underscores the difficulty of governing our country as a federation, a challenge that adds another layer of pressure on top of the external negotiation with the United States. There's also a domestic political fight happening inside Canada itself, running in parallel to the one with Washington, and it has put real pressure on Carney from a completely different direction. According to CBC News and the Canadian press, on August the 9th, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre sent Carney a public letter, shared directly with reporters, accusing the Prime Minister of caving to American demands and urging him to show some backbone in these negotiations. Poilievre and his party's Canada-U.S. relations critic, Shuvaloy Majumdar, argued that Ottawa has already given ground on multiple fronts over the past year, scrapping Canada's digital services tax, removing Canada's counter-tariffs on the United States, and agreeing to share net toll revenue from the newly opened Gordie Howe International Bridge with Washington. Worse, you have lost ground, the letter reads, according to CBC's reporting. With American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum doubling and broadening and tariffs on lumber tripling, Poilievre's letter goes on to reject Carney's own past framing that no deal is better than a bad deal, arguing instead that Canadians in manufacturing-heavy cities dependent on cross-border supply chains are the ones actually paying the price for that patience. Before you concede anything else, Canadians deserve a good deal, Poilievre and Majumdar wrote, according to Pinau. No more pursuing policies of a managed decline at home. No more caving. To be fair to Carney, Poilievre's letter was not entirely adversarial. The Conservative leader also said his party supports the Prime Minister's underlying goal of building leverage toward a tariff-free arrangement, and separately offered, months earlier, to personally help negotiate with American lawmakers if it would move talks forward. But the core message was unmistakable. Pressure on Carney to hold the line is not only coming from Washington, it is coming from his own political opposition in Ottawa, publicly, in writing, at the exact moment his negotiators are sitting across the table from Jameson Greer. That domestic pressure runs directly into another sensitive front in these talks: dairy. According to Pinau's reporting, Carney said just days ago that his government remains loyal to Canada's supply management system, the regulatory structure that controls dairy production and import quotas, and which Greer has specifically criticized as unfair to American farmers. Dairy Farmers of Canada, an industry group representing Canadian producers, has publicly urged the government not to offer further concessions on the sector, arguing that Canada has already made repeated concessions in past rounds of talks, only to be met each time with fresh American demands. That dynamic, give ground once, get asked for more next time, is precisely the pattern both Poilievre and former Ambassador David McNaughton have separately warned about, from very different political vantage points, in describing the risk of Canada negotiating piecemeal rather than holding out for one comprehensive resolution. It's also worth noting that this is not the first deadline this negotiation has blown past. According to CBC News, Carney and Trump agreed on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, back in June, to reach some form of trade deal by late July, a self-imposed target that was later pushed to August the 1st and then missed entirely. Poilievre, in an earlier letter sent ahead of an October meeting between Carney and Trump at the White House, accused the Prime Minister of failing to deliver the win he had promised Canadians over the summer. That history of missed deadlines is part of why analysts covering this story, including the team at Newsquawk, caution against assuming August the 19th will necessarily be the moment everything resolves one way or the other. Deadlines in this relationship so far have proven to be far more flexible in practice than they appear on paper. There are also warnings coming from people who have sat in this exact seat before. David McNaughton, a former Canadian ambassador to the United States, told BNN Bloomberg, as reported by Qs.com, that while Canada has put together a substantial package of proposals, he is not convinced Washington is actually ready for a comprehensive deal. At the end of the day, the only person that's going to make the final deal is going to be the president. And I'm not sure that he's ready right now to do a comprehensive deal, which is really what the Canadian side want, McNaughton said. He specifically cautioned against Canada making piecemeal concessions, giving ground on individual issues one at a time, warning that doing so could leave the country exposed to further tariff threats down the road without ever securing the durable relief it is actually looking for. That warning lines up almost exactly with the broader cornering dynamic this story opened with. Give a little now, hope for relief later, and risk finding yourself back at the negotiating table again in a few months with less leverage than you started with. LeBlanc himself has hinted at a similar concern, telling reporters he believes a truly durable solution will ultimately require a direct conversation between Carney and Trump themselves, because in his assessment, Greer lacks the authority to close a deal on his own, a striking thing for a Canadian minister to say publicly about his own primary counterpart in these negotiations, according to reporting from Indexbox. Greer's broader timeline for this relationship also matters here, because it shows this is not just about the August 19th deadline in isolation. It is one stage in a much longer process. According to the Globe and Mail, Greer told the Senate Finance Committee that tougher, more structural changes to the trade agreement, things like tighter regional content requirements for vehicles built in North America and stronger labor and environmental provisions, will not even be addressed until 2027, including with Congress in the following year. In the meantime, according to that same reporting, Greer has complained repeatedly that Canada has been more difficult to deal with than Mexico, refusing to bend on key American demands as a precondition for deeper talks. In a notably different track, Greer traveled to Mexico City in July for a third round of bilateral talks on USMCA changes with Mexican officials. Sessions Canada was not invited to participate in, according to the Globe and Mail, raising a real risk that Ottawa could eventually find itself under pressure to accept terms that Washington and Mexico City settle on without Canadian input at all. Greer did tell the Senate committee, notably, that he had spoken with his Canadian counterpart and that Canada had not said they're going to retaliate further. A small but telling signal that, even amid the public tension, direct lines of communication between the two negotiating teams have stayed open. And what is actually at stake if this falls apart? According to a report from the Canadian-American Business Council, cited by Retail Insider Canada and referenced in Transport Topics coverage, a full breakdown of the U.S. Canada trade relationship at this stage could put as many as 102,000 Canadian jobs at risk. That is not an abstract number. That is the kind of figure that shapes how a prime minister talks about not accepting a bad deal versus rushing to accept any deal at all just to stop the bleeding. Which brings us to where things actually stand as of this recording, and to the line that has become Mark Carney's defining public message throughout this entire standoff. According to Bloomberg's reporting from August the 13th, 2026, Carney made a pledge roughly a year ago after a meeting with Canada's provincial leaders that he has since repeated many, many times in public. Canada will not accept a bad deal. Bloomberg's own framing of that pledge is worth noting directly because it captures exactly how central that phrase has become to Carney's political identity throughout this fight. A short, blunt sentence that Carney keeps returning to. Deal after deal, deadline after deadline. As the baseline test, he says he will not compromise below. It is worth being precise here, because precision matters in a story like this. The exact, verified, on-the-record language most consistently tied to Carney throughout this dispute includes that pledge: Canada will not accept a bad deal, along with his earlier repeated formulations that nothing is off the table and that all options remain on the table if the United States proceeds with further tariffs. Those are the phrases Carney has actually used, confirmed by Reuters, Bloomberg, CBC, and the Associated Press across multiple separate occasions. Whatever short, punchy framing gets attached to a headline, the substance underneath it is consistent. Carney has built his entire public posture in this negotiation around refusing to be rushed into an agreement he considers unfavorable, no matter how close the deadline gets or how much pressure Washington applies. And, as of the most recent reporting available, Reuters, via U.S. News, dated August the 13th, 2026, a Canadian government source directly familiar with the negotiations said that the United States, too, is now keen on reaching a deal before the August 19th deadline. That detail matters, because it suggests this is no longer simply a story of Washington pressuring a reluctant Ottawa. Both sides, according to that source, now have real incentive to land an agreement before the tariffs actually take effect, rather than living through the economic disruption of watching them kick in. A newsletter from Newsquawk, summarizing market-facing analysis, described this situation with a useful piece of historical context. Bilateral tariff deadlines like this one have, in the past, followed a well-established pattern. Negotiations run right up to the deadline and are frequently extended or partially resolved through side arrangements rather than sweeping, comprehensive deals, with markets generally treating the worst-case outcome as a fading risk until the deadline is truly just hours away. Whether that pattern holds this time is genuinely unknown, and no one covering this story, not Reuters, not Bloomberg, not CTV, not any of the officials quoted directly, has claimed to know the outcome in advance. As of this recording, there's no finalized deal, there's a framework being discussed, there are ongoing meetings, the most recent confirmed as of August the 12th, there's a hard deadline of August the 19th, and there's a Canadian Prime Minister who has spent the better part of a year repeating, in one form or another, that he would rather walk away from the table than sign something he considers a bad deal for Canadian workers. Before we close, a brief note on sourcing, because that matters in a story with this many moving pieces. Everything in this script is drawn from a named, checkable reporting. Reuters, Bloomberg, the Associated Press, the Globe and Mail, CBC News, CTV News, the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, the Washington Times, The Hill, Fox News, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Epic Times, the Western Producer, DTN, Transport Topics, and BNN Bloomberg via Accusa.com, along with direct, attributed quotes from Prime Minister Mark Carney, Trade Representative Jameson Greer, Minister Dominic LeBlanc, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, former Ambassador David McNaughton, and President Donald Trump himself. Two things remain genuinely unresolved and should be treated that way. First, whether an actual deal gets signed before August the 19th, or whether the 50% tariffs take effect as scheduled, is not yet known. The reporting as of this recording describes negotiations in progress, not a completed agreement. Second, the specific three-word warning framing referenced in the title of this video reflects Carney's now well-established, repeatedly stated public posture. Phrases like, Canada will not accept a bad deal, and nothing's off the table, rather than one single, verified three-word sentence uttered in one specific moment. Where the record is clear, this script has stayed with the record. Where it is not, that has been said plainly, rather than smoothed over for effect. So here is the honest, open question at the center of all of this. Jameson Greer's strategy has been built around getting Canada to make its concessions first. On the theory that tariff relief follows, Mark Carney has spent a year publicly betting that Canadian voters and Canadian industry will back him if he refuses to move on that basis without guarantees in writing. Both men have real leverage. Both men have real constraints back home. And in exactly 1 week, on August the 19th, we find out whose read on this standoff was right. Do you think Ottawa is right to hold the line this close to the deadline, or is Carney risking real economic damage to Canadian workers by refusing to bend? Let me know what you think happens next. Thanks for watching.